This is the reason why Pokemon Legends ZA has 2 Johto Starters. This was pretty obviously the most shocking and surprising thing that came out of that recent gameplay reveal trailer for Legends ZA, and it has pretty much everyone asking why this is the case, because it feels like a pretty odd choice to make. Well, in this video, I am going to be explaining to you why they went with the double Johto Starters for the starter trio in Legends ZA, at least by my own determination. After analyzing this whole situation, I have come up with what I believe to be at least a major reason, if not the definitive reason, why they went with 2 Johto Starters for the starter trio of this title. However, with that said, a big part of what I'm going to be talking about in this video is the fact that I don't think it's just one particular reason why they made the choices they did here. I believe there are a number of contributing factors that ultimately led Game Freak to picking Chikorita, Tepig, and Totodile as the 3 starters that would comprise the starter trio of this game. So I'm going to be discussing what I think could be some of those contributing factors, and then a little later on in the video I'm going to be getting to my major reason that I think is the major reason why we have 2 Johto Starters in this group. The first thing that I would like to take into consideration here is that I do believe it's possible that Game Freak did want to have some kind of connection or relation to the starters of the previous Legends game in Legends Arceus, with Rowlet, Cyndaquil, and Oshawott. Obviously, this does make sense because we saw Cyndaquil, the 3rd Johto starter alongside Totodile and Chikorita, appear as a starter in Legends Arceus, and not only did we see that, we also saw a Unova starter in that game as well in the form of Oshawott, which are the 2 regions that are being represented in Legends ZA's starters. There is obviously a bit of a format with the Legends games, especially now that we have a second Legends game that can build off of the first one, so I could definitely see this as something that Game Freak sort of wanted to have there as a connection between the 2 titles. That is admittedly a pretty surface level reason though, so let's go ahead and steadily get into some more deeper stuff. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is something that I have touched on in a previous video, and that is Game Freak might be making a concerted effort to have more Johto representation in this title as a part of just having more Johto representation in general in some of the recent games that they have put out. We saw a decent amount of Johto representation in Legends Arceus, with Cyndaquil obviously being one of the starter Pokemon, and Pokemon like Quillfish and Stantler getting brand new evolutions. As a follow-up from that, in Scarlet and Violet, we saw a ton more Johto representation, with Pokemon like Girafarig, Donphan, and even Delibird getting new forms and evolutions. So, following that up with even more Johto representation, with Chikorita and Totodile being present, it definitely feels like Game Freak are making an intentional choice to show off and feature as many Johto Pokemon as they can in their recent games. And the reason why they could be doing this is where it gets really interesting, because we obviously have not had a Johto-focused, centric game in a long time. It is the region that has not been revisited in the longest amount of time as of this point, and so if Game Freak are shining the light on Johto Pokemon in these other games, does that kinda cast doubt on the possibility of a new Johto game coming in the near future? So this kinda speaks to the release schedule politics of Pokemon games in the next few years or so, and that could be playing a major factor as to why the Johto starters are getting a little extra special treatment in not only Legends Arceus, but now in Legends ZA as well. Because Game Freak essentially might know that we're not going to have a Johto game for 5 to 10 years, so they want to give Johto Pokemon their time to shine now, and essentially hold us over a little longer until we eventually get to that Johto game that might not be coming for a little while. And along those same kind of lines, there has also been a pretty ominous connection and emphasis on not only Johto related stuff, but also Unova related stuff as well. You probably can remember all of the Black and White remake hype that was going on after Scarlet and Violet came out and into its DLC season. Before Legend ZA came out, we all just thought that that was inevitably going to be the next title that we were going to get. That's how strong all of the symbols were, and Johto was right alongside all of that Unova hype and the Unova kind of rumors as well. And now that we are essentially continuing that kind of duality and representation with the starters in Legend ZA, what does this all mean? This could once again be sort of an indicator or a point in the direction of what Game Freak have in mind in terms of the games that they have planned for the next 5-ish or so years. It maybe could be a sign, therefore, of a Johto game or a Unova game coming fairly soon, but it could also be a sign that we're not going to be getting a game in those regions for a while, and this is meant as sort of a holdover for that. It's really hard to say one way or another what this amounts to, if anything at all, but it does seem to be the case that emphasis is being put on those regions, and the Legend ZA starters could very well be a continuation of that and contributing to that reasoning that Game Freak has in mind, whatever that is. Another major factor that probably very much helped to determine these 3 starters in particular has to do with what they are planned for in terms of their final evolutions. There's been a lot of talk about whether we're going to get megas for these starters or regional variants like in Legends Arceus, but I think the consensus is that something new is going to happen to them. And I think a big reason why we did get these starters in particular is because of what Game Freak want to do with these starters. So for instance, if we did actually get regional variants for the starter evolutions, it means that whatever Game Freak has planned for those regional variants, it probably fits the best with these 3 in particular. Given that we're in the Kalos region, those regional variants would very likely have some French influence and connection, and so Chikorita, Totodile, and Tepig might have something within them that we just can't see right now because we don't have the full picture that lends themselves well to being incorporated a little more in French culture. If they do decide to go in the regional variant evolution direction with these starters, that could also help to explain why a couple other starters aren't the starters in this game, namely Snivy and Piplup, who were widely seen as the most likely candidates, including by myself. If regional variants are what they want to do for the evolutions, it actually makes complete sense why those 2 are not selected, because they already have so much French influence. So that not only explains away a couple of starters already, which leaves the door open all the more for the starters that we got, but it also, in my opinion, increases the likelihood that we are going to get regional variants as opposed to something like Mega Evolution. Another thing, however, that definitely needs to be considered here as well is that these starters and the reason why they are here could have some plot and story connection in this game too. We do not know who we are getting these starters from, and therefore it could be the case that the person we are getting them from has a reason why they are giving us a choice between these 3 starters in particular. We saw something similar in Legends Arceus with Professor Laventon, who obviously had come from another region to Hisui, and during his travels and his research into Pokemon had acquired these 3 to eventually give to you for your Hisui adventure. So there was a lore explanation as to why we were picking these guys as opposed to the regular Sinnoh starters, and I feel like there will also be something similar going on in Legend ZA. That will probably play just a small part in the overarching reason why, because I feel like it all has to do with the background first, and then they will explain it away with plot and lore later, but it is still something that I feel like will contribute to the overall idea of why these starters are in this game. And finally, we have now come to what I believe to be one of, if not the biggest reason as to why we have the starters we do in this game, and why we have 2 Johto starters in particular. I personally think it just comes down to logistics, semantics, and circumstance. And I know that might not be the most exciting answer of all time, and it probably sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but I really do believe that is the most likely explanation. For instance, with this being a Legends game, and given the starters that we did actually get, it's obvious that they wanted to continue the Legends-style format for the starter Pokemon. With that in mind, and given the fact that this game takes place in Kalos, and it's seen the return of Mega Evolution, that combination of elements actually eliminates most starters as a candidate for being a starter in this game right off the bat. For example, with the Legends starter format in place, that immediately eliminates the Kalos starters, with the return of Mega Evolution also likely meaning the return of every Mega Evolution we've seen to this point. That also means that the Kanto starters and the Hoenn starters are pretty much out as well, because even though they do have Mega Evolutions, and that means that they're going to be in this game, those are Mega Evolutions that we've already seen, and the starters in this game, whatever they end up doing with their evolutions, are more than likely going to do something completely new, so they're not going to reuse old Megas for these new set of starters. Therefore, Kanto and Hoenn starters would immediately be out of the running as well. We can also pretty decisively and immediately eliminate the Paldea starters because they were just introduced and utilized in Scarlet and Violet, and there was no chance whatsoever that any one of them were going to be immediately reused in a Legends title in the game that immediately preceded the game that they were first introduced in, so they had no shot whatsoever right off the bat too. That pretty much takes out half of our available starter options immediately with no extra thought or deliberation required whatsoever. And at this point, you might be able to see where I'm going with this. These next regions have a little bit more of a case, but there's also a few that we can pretty easily eliminate too. Like for instance, the Generation 8 starters. If we were to assume, as I said before, that these starters in Legends ZA are going to get regional variants, which is a major possibility, I believe that that pretty much eliminates the Galar starters as well, because Galar and Kalos, in relation to their real-world inspirations, are pretty much going to be right next to each other in terms of location. So it wouldn't make sense for the starters of the Galar region to have regional variants in the Kalos region when the two regions are practically next door neighbors. And you also don't have the advantage or the cop-out or excuse, if you will, of saying that the regional variant is due to the time frame of this game, kind of like what we saw in Legends Arceus with it being set in the past, because this game is obviously in the modern day, so there's no extra cop-out or excuse you can use there for that kind of situation, and therefore I think that pretty decisively eliminates the Galar starters too. And following up Galar, it can be pretty reasonably understood that Game Freak also wouldn't want to use the Sinnoh starters in this game, because Sinnoh just had all the spotlight on it in Legends Arceus. And granted, the Sinnoh starters weren't the starters in that game, and they also didn't get any new forms or anything like that, but nevertheless, that was still their time to shine. So from Game Freak's perspective, it makes all the sense in the world to want to do something else with this follow-up title. And as I mentioned earlier, if we're going in the regional variant direction, that also eliminates Piplup at least one of the Sinnoh starters all the more. So it makes all the sense in the world, even if it's not quite as definitive as to why the Sinnoh starters wouldn't be used here either. And with all of those region starters eliminated, that leaves us with just 3 regions left that we can legitimately pick from. And wouldn't you know it, that comes down to Johto, Unova, and Alola, which are the same 3 regions that Legends Arceus starters picked from as well. And when we break this down, it really starts to make even more sense as to why we got the starters we did, because at this point, it just becomes a process of elimination. If the starters in this game do in fact get regional variant evolutions, as I've been talking about throughout this video, and as I've also mentioned throughout this video, is a very strong possibility, that is pretty conclusively going to eliminate Snivy, because as I also mentioned before, Snivy is already pretty French themed, so giving it a regional variant that is influenced by French culture in the Kalos region just isn't going to make sense, because that's what it already is. We also can eliminate Oshawott for being a Legends starter already in Legends Arceus, and so from Unova, the only starter that we now have available to us is Tepig, and wouldn't you know it, it is one of the starters that actually got into this game. And since we've officially eliminated Snivy, we can also pretty easily put Chikorita into the grass type slot here, because the only other grass type available other than Chikorita at this point that hasn't been eliminated is Rowlet, and it obviously was a Legends Arceus starter. So now Chikorita is another Pokemon that can actually be in the game, and wouldn't you know it, it is in fact one of the ZA starters. And when it comes to the water starters, we have already eliminated Oshawott, as I just mentioned, and so it really just comes down to Totodile and Popplio. And while Popplio doesn't really have a reason as to why it would be conclusively eliminated from consideration like a bunch of these other starters do, if you look at it from Game Freak's perspective when they're weighing their options, they've already got Chikorita and Tepig locked in. If they were to go with Popplio and have a trio of Chikorita, Tepig, and Popplio, that is quite literally the least liked trio of starter Pokemon of all time. This is something that was mentioned by the fans in the lead up to this, because this is a trio that was actually brought up in the community, and it is something that was decried as the least popular bunch that could possibly be constructed, and Game Freak definitely would be aware of that to at least some kind of degree. So I feel like in the interest of just making this starter group a little more appealing, they just opted to go with Totodile, because they didn't want to deal with the backlash if they included Popplio and introduced a starter trio that is comprised of basically the 3 least liked starters of all time. At least with Totodile, you have something to go with in terms of popularity in comparison to the lesser liked Tepig and Chikorita. So at least it helps things to even out a little bit in that regard. And then when you consider all of the other factors that I mentioned prior to this big point that Totodile kinda meshes well with as well, it just kinda makes it plain to see, and it makes it a little more clear as to why we got the starters we did, and why we got the 2 Johto starters that we did in particular. It very well could have just been a process of elimination and a desire to not put the worst starter trio of all time in this game. I do feel like that is a pretty compelling argument, to be honest, but at the end of the day, that is just my own personal opinion and analysis of the situation. So if you guys have any other thoughts or opinions yourselves, be sure to let me know with the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more Pokemon content and more Legends ZA content as well. I will also be back very soon with another new video too, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Thank you guys so much for watching this one. I really appreciate it. And until then, as always, I will smell you guys later.